The night the world discovered Esther Beaumont was not the night of a promotion or a grand opening. It was the night a stranger stumbled into a Brooklyn diner at 2 in the morning, whispering in a language that didn't belong to the fluorescent lights and chipped coffee cups. By the time Esther set down the second cup of coffee, a billionaire at the next table had already written her future on a napkin. Before we begin, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, feel free to share where you're reading from. It's always beautiful to see how far stories like this can travel. Enjoy the story. The window of all-night diner was smeared with rain and dream residue. A neon sign hissed and flickered, painting the blackened sidewalk a fatigued pink. Esther refilled a pair of mugs and tucked a loose coil of hair back into her bun, telling herself the ache in her lower back was just the shoes she couldn't afford to replace. She remembered that, once, she'd stood in a white-walled studio with paint under her nails and a professor who said the word composition like it was salvation. She'd also remembered the tuition letter, the numbers that made her mother's laugh go brittle, the phone calls she never returned. The art school had become a postcard on her fridge. The waitress uniform had become a second skin that never quite fit. A man in a damp wool coat scraped rain off his cap and sunk into a booth like it might swallow him. "Pardon," he said to the emptiness, to no one in particular. "Je n'y comprends pas les directions." Esther froze on instinct and turned. "Vous avez besoin d'aide?" She asked, and as soon as she heard her own French, loose and warm, a part of her that had been asleep sat up. His face lifted, wet lashes blinking fast. "Je oui, je suis perdu, je cherche la station, comment on dit le métro?" "Vous êtes tout prise," she reassured, leaning on the table and drawing a crude map on the placemat with her pen. "Prenez la rue la basse jusqu'à la lumière, puis tournez à gauche. Je puis appeler un taxi si vous voulez." She spoke softly because French felt like hands cupping a flame, and here, on this battlefield of ketchup bottles and cracked formica, it felt indecent to shout. Across the aisle, someone turned a page of the Financial Times. The man, he was in his 60s maybe, with the worried eyebrows of a grandfather, dabbed at his eyes with his sleeve and stumbled over a thank you. "Passe de quoi," she said, and then added, because kindness is such a cheap thing to offer but somehow always costly, "Restez. Prenez une soupe. Vous êtes trempé jusqu'aux os." He smiled at that, to the bones, and looked like maybe he'd cry properly, not the polite tears a polite man squeezes back for strangers. Esther brought him soup and warm bread and a black coffee, and 10 minutes later she was speaking rapidly into her phone to a cab company she trusted, translating the address of a host who apparently had not waited up as promised. Her French, which had been draped over her like an old scarf for years, came to life around the edges. She forgot to feel self-conscious. She forgot the clock. "Merci mille fois," the man said when he stood to leave, grabbing her hand in both of his. "Votre mère est française, non? Vous avez l'accent de Lyon." "My mother," she confirmed, and the word felt tender and raw. "Elle est partie quand j'avais 12 ans." She tucked the tip money back into his pocket when he tried to press it into her palm. He left trailing a promise to send a postcard. The bell over the door tittered above his head. Esther exhaled and turned toward the coffee pots. The man with the Financial Times closed his paper. He had the careful posture of someone who owned a lot of things and was trying to take up slightly less space because of it. He was alone, though there were 2 glasses at his table, and the second had a thin ring of condensation around it that told a story of someone who'd left hurriedly. His eyes were gray, the kind the sky gets when it hasn't decided yet whether to rain again. He paid without a fuss. When Esther returned to clear his table 10 minutes later, there was a napkin tucked under the edge of the empty bread plate, folded into an impossibly neat square. On it, in tidy block letters, was a note: "Your French is excellent. Your courage is better. If you want to do something impossible, meet me at Teterboro, Gate 3, at dawn. One way to Paris. There's a woman there who will only listen if you speak to her in the language she learned to dream in. A.S." Under the note, she found a ticket. Not a printed stub from a commercial airline, but an embossed card with a tail number and clearance, Esther Beaumont, typed like an incantation. Under that, a business card with a phone number whose area code meant nothing to her. Esther laughed, the shaky kind that finds its way out when you are very tired and the world does something you've only seen in movies. She looked around for cameras. She looked at Maya. Maya was drying mugs behind the counter, eyes narrowed. A chain of tiny gold moons winked at her collarbone. On a normal night, she wore eyeliner like a weapon and had a comeback holstered for everything. Tonight, she went very quiet. "What's it say?" she asked, and Esther handed her the napkin like it might bite. Maya read it once, twice, then looked up with a face that meant don't. "And also, if you do, take me with you." "Alexander Sterling," Maya whispered. "I swear to God, is that who it is?" Esther turned the business card over, Sterling Capital. "Do you know him?" "The Alexander Sterling, the one who owns half the sky. He's a billionaire, like actual B with a B. He dated that ballerina, the one who never mind." "Esther, this is some pretty woman meets taken scenario. Why is a billionaire inviting you to Paris at 3 in the morning?" He heard the French. "And decided what? You're a translator? For what? A yacht?" Maya breathed out hard. "Don't go." The clock over the pie case insisted it was 2:53 a.m. Dawn in November came cold and graceless. Esther's shoes pinched. Her heart was running laps in a body that felt like a borrowed coat. "What if it's real?" she asked. "What if it's a trap?" Maya countered, voice low. "You are not a rescue mission. You're my best friend and my rent's due and your life matters. This is how people end up in Dateline specials." Esther looked down at the napkin again. "Your courage is better." It annoyed her, immediately, that he'd presumed that like he'd peeked under her ribs and catalogued her guts. She wanted to throw it away out of spite. She wanted to go because it was ridiculous. She wanted to go because no one had ever addressed anything to her like that. She wanted to go because her mother had never forgiven herself for leaving Lyon and had taught Esther that bravery sometimes is just the willingness to be misunderstood. "Call the number," Maya conceded when Esther didn't move. "I'm on speaker. If a serial killer answers, we hang up." Esther tapped the number with the pad of her thumb, pulse leaping. The line clicked on the first ring. "Miss Beaumont," a crisp female voice said. "I'm Renata with Sterling Capital's office of the CEO. Mr. Sterling asked me to extend the invitation personally. Transportation can be provided from any location." "Do you have a passport?" "Yes," Esther heard herself say, like she was deciding in real time to be the kind of person who had one and used it. Yes." "Excellent. There's a driver in a black SUV waiting 2 blocks south of the diner's back door. We'll need you at gate 3 of Teterboro by 5:15. Bring only what you can carry." "Carry for what?" Maya mouthed, and Esther didn't have a good answer. "Carry for whom?" "For Paris," Renata answered, as if she'd heard. "Miss Beaumont, this is an opportunity to do something important. Mr. Sterling thinks you might be the only person who can make it work." "Make what work?" Esther asked. But Renata only said, "We'll explain en route," and then, as if she remembered how to be a person, added, "Please be careful on the sidewalk. It's slick." She hung up. Maya grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself, as if the floor had leaned. "Girl, if you are not back by Tuesday, I'm burning New Jersey to the ground." Esther folded the napkin. The ink was dry and didn't smudge under her thumb. She put it in her pocket, and suddenly, the uniform didn't feel like a straitjacket. It felt like armor she could shed and come back to. The apron tied at her waist was just a rope, and ropes are for climbing. The SUV was exactly where Renata said it would be. The driver didn't seem surprised that she had only a backpack with a sweater, a change of underwear she'd shoved into the bottom drawer 3 years ago, and the tiny metal thimble her grandmother had left her when she died. Sterling silver worn smooth by work. The driver glanced once in the rearview mirror, as if to confirm her existence, and then focused on the road. The world between 3 and 4 a.m. has its own temperature. It holds its breath. Streetlights hum about nothing, and the bridges look like they've folded their steel prayer hands and are waiting for something like an answer. At Teterboro, there was a small aircraft with the paint job of a steel shark and a flight crew dressed like fate. Esther pressed her hand to the tail of the plane to feel if it was warm. It was. Good, she thought. Not a dream. "Miss Beaumont?" The man at the foot of the stairs wasn't wearing a coat despite the cold, and his tie was so plain it seemed expensive. In contrast to the stoic composure he had at the diner, he now looked like he was exhaling for the first time all week. "I'm Alexander Sterling." He didn't offer to shake her hand. He looked at it like he wanted to, then tucked his fingers into his coat pockets. His hair had that intentional disarray men paid other men to achieve. He was younger than she'd thought billionaires were supposed to be, though maybe that's just the way exhaustion shaves years off and adds them back in all the wrong places. I brought coffee, he said awkwardly, as if it were an apology. I heard you pour it half the night. Do people usually say yes? She asked, taking the cup he offered and holding it in both hands. Almost never, he said. Often they do not call. So I'm the gullible kind, she retorted. I think you're the kind who can tell when a person is actually lost, he replied, and the softness in his voice took her off guard. And when they are lying about it. They looked at each other for a heartbeat too long, and she, because she hated awkwardness until it started to feel like truth, asked, "Why Paris?" They climbed the stairs. The cabin smelled like cedar and citrus instead of canned air, and the seats were so comfortable, Esther immediately felt the lack of them in her life. He indicated a seat. A woman with hair that didn't move poured her sparkling water like it was a ritual. The engines whined with a promise. "There's a Mason in Paris," Alexander began, and the way he pronounced Mason made her want to correct him. Mason Lefebvre. You probably haven't heard of it unless you're into scarves. Hand-painted silks, Esther said before she could stop herself. Founded in 1948 by Émile Lefebvre. Their signature pigment is Le Bleu des Nuits, like the blue of the inside of your eyelids when you're about to fall asleep. My mother had one scarf. She kept it in a drawer and took it out twice a year like it was an icon. When my grandmother died, she folded the scarf around the thimble and said, "Remember the hands who make the world beautiful." Esther stopped. She hadn't told anyone that sentence in 5 years. I know the Mason. We're trying to acquire it, Alexander said. We've made 3 trips. Brought the best translators, the best lawyers, the best people. Mrs. Lefebvre will not return our calls. She has said to my face that the only thing she hates more than venture capital is rain in April. Esther smiled. It made her want to meet the woman. My board wants the deal, he continued. It would be a jewel in our portfolio. But the Mason is not a thing. It's a woman in an apartment with a parlor that smells like jasmine tea. It's 30 artisans in a warehouse near the canal. It's 100 years of hands. I can buy it with money, but I can't keep it with a spreadsheet. If we are the wrong kind of partner, if we don't promise the right things, it will die under a logo. And what am I? She asked. She did not know if she should be offended to have been discovered like a Port Authority indie flick. A person she might listen to, Alexander said simply. A woman who speaks French without looking at me like she's calculating my wallet. Someone who knows that scarf isn't just a scarf. I watched you with that tourist. Your face changed. You can't fake how people hold someone else's map. And why do you care? She asked bluntly. You could buy a fossil and call it art. You could keep your board happy and let the Mason fend for itself. Because my mother ironed my father's shirts until the day she died, even after she could afford to pay someone else, he said, and the sentence landed in the cabin like a quiet object. Because she used to say, make money, but don't do it like they taught your father to do it. Do it like the seamstresses. Stitch by stitch, small and careful, and it lasts. Because I've made a lot of money doing things that impress people who forget to bring their souls to work. I'm tired of that version of me. He watched the clouds like they were the pages of a book he'd already read. Because I can afford to do something right. Esther looked at him. People spoke about money like a force of weather, storms that came and went. She'd always suspected it was a symptom, not an element. If he was telling the truth, it would be easy to like him. If he was lying, he was good at it. What do you actually need? She asked. We have a meeting with the board tomorrow, he said. Not at the Mason, at a sterile office where they make small green sludges in the cafe and call it juice. You will sit at the table and say nothing. You will watch Mrs. Lefebvre. If she speaks in French, you will listen. And then, Alexander said, and his mouth twisted slightly, you will tell me what nobody else has managed to tell me. That she doesn't like you? That too, he said with naked humor, but more than that, tell me what will make her trust that we will protect what she has made. What if there is nothing? Esther asked. Then we fly home, he said, and I will try again in a month or not. And why me? She asked again, like if she could peel the answer to its pit, she would know whether to jump. Because you're not entangled with the kind of power she'd spit at, he said. Because you were willing to spend 10 minutes arranging a stranger's night so it hurt less. Because your file cost me 7 minutes to build and you did not exist in it, no public art, no LinkedIn, no performative sad Instagram. Just an old scholarship, a mother who, he stopped, like he'd walked into a room he hadn't meant to see. And because when you spoke French, I felt like I was eavesdropping on a prayer. The plane tilted. The sky tilted with it. Esther's stomach wasn't sure what to do about any of it. She thought of Maya, of the burner phone tucked into her pocket, of the absurdity of being paid in one trip more than she made in a month. She thought of her mother's voice on the night she left Lyon, promising they'd go back someday. "I'm going to Paris to help a billionaire buy a scarf company," she texted Maya, thumbs clumsy. "Bring me back a life," Maya texted back. Paris met them like a lover who had been woken too early and then forgave it immediately. The November air was a thin apology for summer's excess. Esther had forgotten to be stunned by cities a long time ago. Poverty numbs and glitter is a cold thing. But as the car crossed the Seine, and the buildings did that thing where they looked like a line of poems, a part of her that had grown careful and inward turned its face toward the light and dared to hope. Sterling's team was waiting in a glass tower that could have been in any city and felt like nowhere. Caldwell, tall and the color of management fees, shook Esther's hand like a mistake he couldn't quite chase from the ledger. There was a woman named Sloane whose cheekbones entered rooms before the rest of her and who smiled as if she'd rehearsed the exact angle. "This is our consultant," Alexander said, and the way he stumbled on the word made Esther weirdly proud. Caldwell didn't bother hiding his surprise. "From where?" "Brooklyn," Esther supplied, and he stared at her in a way that made her want to tell him exactly how many double shifts she could string in a week and still pay taxes. They briefed. Caldwell displayed charts with the cadence of someone who had learned PowerPoint as a native language. Sloane explained competitive landscapes, like they were describing the weather on Mars. Alexander listened and glanced at Esther when the French phrases slid off the table and spilled under the chairs. She wrote them down without being told. At the far end of the room, a TV flashed images of headlines: "Swiss conglomerate makes play for Lefebvre." "Parisian icon up for grabs." There was a photo of Genevieve Lefebvre stepping out of a black car in a coat the color of heavy cream, chin like a battle line. Her hair was winter white. Her eyes were a question you did not want to be asked. "She doesn't want us," Caldwell said bluntly. "She wants a white knight with a French last name. She would probably sell to the Swiss if she didn't hate them more. We need to convince her that we are, what, suitable. We need to make a promise we can keep," Alexander said, and Caldwell's face said, "No, we need to make a promise they will accept until we close." They walked to the meeting through a rain that wasn't ambitious enough to make anyone open an umbrella. Esther tucked her grandmother's thimble into the small inner pocket of her coat. She didn't know why she'd brought it. It felt like a talisman. It felt like a doorbell to a very old house. The boardroom smelled like lemon oil and resentment. Men in suits arranged themselves like flagpoles while women with hands like orchids passed around tiny cups. The translator, a man with a clean jaw and a patient smile, took his place beside Alexander. Esther sat 2 chairs down and folded into silence. Genevieve arrived late, wearing the kind of silk that had a memory. She was not beautiful in the way of magazines. She was beautiful in the way of stones that had withstood storms. The room shifted almost imperceptibly, like the weather had changed. She took her chair and gave none of her attention to the men who angled for it. "Bonjour, Madame Lefebvre," Alexander said politely in an accent that had been murdered in an American schoolroom. "Merci de nous recevoir." She glanced at him. She then glanced at Esther, and in that glance there was a flicker of curiosity. "Vous avez amené une fille," she said to the room, not unkindly. "You have brought a girl." "J'espère que c'est unseen." Esther did not react. The translator didn't translate the line. She wrote it in her notes and underlined it twice. The meeting proceeded. There were numbers. There were charts. There was talk of protecting brand. There was talk of unlocking value. In French, the words wanted to apologize for themselves. The translator did a beautiful job of making English do tricks. English refused to be elegant and made it sound like a heist. At some point, Genevieve's attention drifted to the window, where the sky was considering more rain. She said something soft in French, almost to herself. "Mon père disait que l'argent n'est qu'un tissu, et souvent, il se déchire." My father said money is only a fabric and often it tears. The translator did not translate that either. Esther looked at Alexander just then, and he must have felt it because he glanced sideways. She tapped twice on her pad, the agreed-upon signal when something passed unrendered that mattered. He nodded. When the meeting ended without a decision, and with a plan to reconvene, Caldwell exhaled and muttered something about missed flight windows. Alexander rubbed a hand over his jaw, a gesture that was either fatigue or ritual. "I'm going to the apartment," he said to his team. "Sloan with me. Caldwell, go charm the accountants. Esther?" "I'll walk," she said. She did not know why. She wanted to be out in Paris while her blood still believed she was here. She took the long way, the streets inside a light drizzle that made the whole city feel like it had been stored in the refrigerator and taken out too early. She cut down an alley that smelled like coffee and wet paper, and that is where she saw her. Genevieve was standing in a courtyard feeding stale pastry to the pigeons like a benevolent dictator refusing to admit defeat. She wasn't wearing her coat now. Her cardigan had a hole at the elbow. It made Esther happy for reasons she couldn't explain, the small frailty of it, the human fact of imperfection on a woman whose image had the crispness of money. Esther stood very still, the way you do when a wild animal is deciding if you are harmless. "Voss meetings," Genevieve said without looking at her. "Ils nie m'intéressent pas. Your meetings do not interest me." "Less means non-plus," Esther replied gently. "Mine don't either." Genevieve turned then, slow. Her eyes were not kind, not yet. They were testing. "Vous êtes américain," she said. "Je suis le genre d'américain qui comprend du vent un foulard," Esther answered, the kind who knows where a scarf comes from. Genevieve looked at her a long time. "Vater accent," she murmured. "Lie on." "Ma mère," Esther said, because the story never began without her. "Ella apris cowder, Saint Etienne. Ma grand mère travailait dans un atelier qui fournissait vater mason, il y a long temps. Les couturières elle appelait la mason qui respire bleu." Genevieve's face changed, the way a closed window responds when someone opens it, and a new air starts to move through the room. "Le bleu des nuits," Genevieve said. "Sied la fierté de mon père. Et son mensonge." She said it like a confession. Esther waited. There was no translator to fill the silence, just rain and birds and a woman who was deciding whether to remember something out loud. "He stole it," Genevieve said finally, and for a heartbeat she was not the matriarch, just the daughter. "He took the formula from a man who took it from a woman who took it from a woman before her. That is how it goes. We pretend the color was always ours and build a palace on a theft. It was wartime. People excused themselves so they could survive." Esther said nothing because some things do not need to be fixed. They need to be heard. "Pourquoi êtes vous ici?" Genevieve asked, eyes bright. "Why are you here?" "Pour cauter si que vous n'avez aucune envie de dire, un homme qui ne connaît pas la différence entre satin et serge," Esther said with a smile that invited companionship instead of complicity. "To listen to what you don't feel like saying to a man who doesn't know the difference between satin and twill." Genevieve laughed, a sound like crystal because it hadn't been used for too long. "Venez," she said finally. "Come." They climbed 3 flights of stairs to an apartment that smelled like bergamot and old paper. There was no art on the walls, only windows that let Paris do the decorating. They sat in a salon that looked like it had entertained entire movements. Genevieve poured tea. They didn't look at each other for a minute, the way strangers who are about to become something else practice not drowning. "You will sell," Esther said softly, not as a question. "I will die," Genevieve replied dryly. "Before that, I must make a choice about what happens to my people." Esther took the thimble out of her pocket and set it on the table. It was nothing, a small silver object too modest to be quaint. It looked ridiculous near the china. "My grandmother," she said. She believed things kept in drawers had souls. Towels folded right, candle ends saved, threads wound back on spools. When she died, my mother wrapped this in your scarf and gave it to me. That was our cathedral. 2 things a man would throw away in a second, saved. If you sell, keep the hands. That is what I came to say to you. Keep the hands." Genevieve reached for the thimble and held it up to the light. Her fingers were long and aged and trembled slightly. She set it back down like it was a promise. "I cannot trust Mr. Sterling," she said simply, "but perhaps I can trust your insistence." "Make him sign what matters," Esther said. Make him sign a document that says your studio in Lyon stays open for 20 years. No layoffs for artisans for 5. Reserve shares for a heritage trust that you chair until your death, and then place into the custody of a museum that will fight for it because they are stubborn and poor. Make him endow an apprenticeship program with your name on it. Write your name in ink on their future. You speak like you've been running meetings your whole life, Genevieve smiled. No, Esther said. I speak like I've carried plates for 10 years and listened to men talk about meetings as if they were wars. Genevieve sat back. And what will you ask in return? Nothing, Esther said, and then surprised herself. Maybe this, that when I asked to bring a woman with me into the room, you opened the door. For whom? For the woman who warned me not to come, for the women on your line who know what dye does to their fingertips, for the women who will sit at tables in Queens and whisper French to their daughters until the daughters forget and the mothers forgive them. Genevieve looked at her. You do not want money? I want you to not die on a hill that does not deserve your bones, Esther replied. When Alexander arrived, he stopped in the doorway, panting slightly from the stairs and from running up them. He looked between Esther and Genevieve and did not hide his surprise. We were just talking about you, Genevieve said in English, and her accent was the exact right amount of Paris. Do not mess this up. Caldwell was apoplectic when he found out they had changed the terms. We can't agree to a heritage trust, he hissed in a corner. Our board will? Will what? Alexander asked, and the grit in his voice scared even him. Fine me, I will write the check. Caldwell, the value here is the thing under the thing. The point is not the building, the point is the work. You're trading upside for sentiment, Caldwell warned. She's playing you? She understands leverage, Alexander countered. She's doing what I hired you to do, only she's kinder, so she'll win. Who? Caldwell demanded, slicing a glance at Esther. The person who is going to teach all of us some manners, Alexander said mildly, and Caldwell shut his mouth. In the car afterward, a message blinked on Alexander's phone. Sterling flies Waitress to Paris. New face of corporate restructuring? The photo of Esther, taken outside the boardroom without her consent, made her look like she'd been dragged out of bed, which she technically had. Under the headline, comments like knives, Esther stared, her face went hot. I need a minute, she said, and stepped onto the sidewalk. The air felt like someone had poured ice into it. She called Maya. They're making a joke of me, she said. They're making a joke of our rent and my mother's hands. Breathe, Maya said. Own it. If they want to make you a symbol, decide what you're a symbol of. I did not sign up for this, Esther whispered. You signed a napkin, Maya reminded her gently. A napkin that said you had courage, prove it wasn't lying. Esther inhaled, then exhaled in a language that wasn't words. She squared her shoulders, walked back into the building, and asked to speak during the press gaggle Caldwell had arranged to spin. He looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Alexander raised an eyebrow but stepped back. The microphones clustered like hungry birds. Miss Beaumont, someone asked in French, are you Mr. Sterling's? Translator, Esther said before he could finish with a word that would turn her to salt. And something else. I grew up in a kitchen where my mother taught me that a stitch is always a promise. Today, Mason Lefebvre and Sterling Capital promise to hold the work above the profit. You can dislike my face in a headline. That's easy. I ask you to pay attention to the paper underneath it. It says seed money for apprenticeships. It says 5 years without layoffs. It says we will not strip an art form and sell its bones. That is my job. That is who I am here. The room, which had been giggling, went quiet. Somewhere in the back, Genevieve laughed softly like a bell. It is not a Hollywood rule, but it is often true. When a woman speaks without asking permission, the world rearranges itself by an inch. Deals are not stories. Deals are wars told by men with nice pens. But the thing that happened next is not easily described with the language of term sheets. There was a tax liability, yes, something born in the 70s and never properly buried. The Swiss conglomerate withdrew their bid and then returned with a new, lower price. Caldwell argued for a walk away. Alexander argued for integrity. The board argued for the ghost of next quarter's numbers that their investors worshipped. The deal teetered on the edge of collapse like a gymnast on her first day in new shoes. There was a sabotage attempt. Somebody leaked the draft of the Heritage Covenant, and the press had a field day with the idea that a billionaire was endowing art when he could be donating to schools. Esther learned quickly that making anything beloved public means it will be both adored and gnawed. And this is the part that felt like fiction, the reappearance of the tourist from the Brooklyn diner. He found her on the sidewalk outside a cheap bakery near the canal, a paper sack warm with a baguette under his arm. "Mademoiselle," he said, delighted. "You came. You found me," she marveled. "You were lost in a city across an ocean, and now you are here, and I am the lost one." He introduced himself, Claude, and produced from inside his coat a letter, creased 100 times. "Je pensais que vous voudriez voir ça," he said. "I thought you would want to see this. Ma sœur a travaillé chez Lefebvre. Elias de mort l'année dernière. Elle voulait dire quelque chose à madame." The letter was handwritten and smelled faintly of lavender. It said, in the small, looping script of someone who learned to write when the world was slower, that she had been part of a team that created a pattern called Nuit sur le Canal in 1972. That it had been credited to a man in a suit who had never touched dye. That she had not minded then, because times were hard and pride is a meal you can eat only sometimes. That she had minded later, when men explained to her how silk was made and she tied her hands behind her back so she wouldn't show them. Esther folded the letter into her chest like a blade and went straight to Genevieve. "I know," Genevieve said before Esther had finished half a sentence. "We all know. We pretended not to." "Stop pretending," Esther said. "Start crediting. Retroactively, publicly, say the names of the women whose designs made your family rich. Put their names in the building forever. Make it hurt a little the way it hurt them." Genevieve looked at her like someone had handed her a cure that required her to admit she'd been sick. "D'accord," she said. "Okay. D'accord." She announced it at the next meeting, in French so clean the translator didn't breathe. There would be a wall of names in the new studio. There would be plaques on old designs. There would be a scholarship named for a seamstress whose children were all born in a town nobody had visited since the highway was built. The press wrote about it like penance. The women at the Mason cried in bathrooms and wiped their noses and went back to working because they were tired and the dye was starting to set. Alexander watched Esther watching all of it. "You did that," he said quietly. "No," she said. "They did. I told them they were allowed to." "Same difference," he murmured. He offered her a job on the last night in Paris. They stood on a balcony in the 7th while Paris rearranged her necklace. The air smelled like heat from other people's dinners and a faint iron rumor from the river. "I want you on my team," he said. "High-paying senior title, the power to poke men with good hair in meetings." "Tempting," she said, not hiding her smile. "You can do what I can't," he said. "You can make people feel seen without turning them into headlines." She thought of the diner. She thought of Maya's laugh and her mother's hands. She thought of the letters that had started arriving already from women who didn't want money, just wanted to read their names on a wall before they died. "I don't want a job," she said slowly. "I want a stake," he blinked. "Equity? You want equity in Lefebvre?" "Performance-based," she said. "Let me lead the integration. Put me in charge of the Heritage Trust. Give me a piece of the company, vesting over time, contingent on outcomes. Keep me poor just long enough to keep me honest. Make me fight for the right things and get paid when I win." He stared at her like she had opened a door in a building he thought he owned and revealed a wing he didn't know existed. Then he threw his head back and laughed, heady with relief. "You are either going to be the making of me," he said, "or the reason I learned the word insolvency in French." She held out her hand. He shook it, a firm grip and no theatrics. "Deal," he said. "Say it in French," she instructed. "Marché conclu," he replied, and it was wrong, but she liked the effort. By the time they signed the papers 2 weeks later under a ceiling painted with a sky that always contained birds, Esther had a team. She had coaxed Meyer onto a plane with the barest of warnings. "What will I do?" Meyer asked on the drive from the airport, face tight with terror disguised as sass. "Talk," Esther said. "Talk to the people who aren't invited to talk. Keep the apprentices from quitting. Keep us honest when we're tired. And when you see me becoming the version of myself I hate, pull me back by my hair." Maya looked out the window at a bridge so old and beautiful it made Esther want to apologize for everything she'd ever said about cities. "Okay," she said. "But if I have to eat snails, I'm leaving you on a curb." The work was not glamorous. It was meetings and more meetings and learning where they kept the good pens and when to bring cake. It was visits to the dye house and headaches from the smell of solvents and learning that if you wore red lipstick, the masks looked less terrible. It was calling the widower of the seamstress from the letter, telling him his wife's name was on the wall now, and listening to him cry while his radio played a football match in the background. It was learning that Caldwell had been the leak and watching Alexander fire him without fury, as if he'd freed both of them. It was signing a lease on a small apartment with crooked floors and learning the sigh of the staircase when you carried groceries. It was waking up one morning in December and seeing her face on a magazine cover in a grocery store and walking away before she could read what they said. And it was everything else, too. It was standing with Genevieve on the factory floor as machines stumbled to life again under new lights and old hands, watching bolts of blue cloth roll off like pieces of night that had decided to be generous. It was watching Alexander in a corner with a teenager from the apprenticeship program, listening like a penitent, learning the difference between warp and weft. It was meeting a man named Hugo Lefebvre, a nephew who had wanted everything sold to the highest bidder until he realized he belonged to the building like a nail belongs to wood. It was being asked on a stage to speak, and saying no, and then saying yes when a girl in the third row stared at her like her face was a map. It was crying in a bathroom because someone had called her a fraud, and then crying again because someone had called her brave. Genevieve's hair got whiter, and her voice got thinner, and she watched the world she'd made make room for itself again. She took Esther's hand in January and said, "I thought I would die hating the men who came to count my rooms. I didn't think I would live to see them count with kindness." "You gave them a reason," Esther said, and Genevieve looked away like she wasn't sure she deserved that. The day Esther went back to Brooklyn, it was snowing like a joke. She stood in the diner doorway and watched the neon sign smear itself into a smear of red over the white. The busser was new and looked at her like he expected her to be mean or famous. She ordered coffee, sat at the counter, and listened to the sizzle of eggs and the radio doing its best. Maya would join her later, an impossible thing, a miracle, a friend who had followed her across an ocean and still liked her. For now, Esther pulled a napkin toward her and wrote on it, then tucked it under the plate of a girl at the far end of the counter who was doing math in a notebook, like she was trying to save someone's life. The girl found it when she reached for the salt. She read, "Your math is excellent. Your courage is better. If you want to do something impossible, call this number." The number belonged to the Heritage Trust's new summer program. It also belonged to Esther, who would pick up, and if the girl was careful or reckless at all in the right way, she would be on a plane in June to Lyon, where the workshops smelled like vinegar and magic. Esther left a tip big enough to make Karma recalibrate. On her way out, a man came in and shook snow off his coat. He said to no one, "Je n'y comprends pas," and Esther didn't translate. Someone else did, a woman in a blue parka who had never been to Europe and still rolled her R's like a lullaby. On the sidewalk, the snow stopped joking and began to fall like work. She tilted her head back and let it fill her eyelashes until the streetlights were just stars she could brush off with her hands. Later that night, in her apartment in Paris with the crooked floors and the sighing staircase, she opened a window to let the cold in and sat down to write a letter. "Mammon," I found the blue. It wasn't a color. It was the way women talk when men forget they are in the room. It was the way a hand learns a shape and teaches it to clothe. It was the way a rich man remembered to be a son. It was the way I learned to be my own mother. We are okay. We work with good lights and we speak French like a prayer that is also a promise. I do not know if this will last. That is not the point. The point is to make something worth missing. I love you. I will write again when the dye dries. E. On the table, beside her grandmother's thimble and a half-finished scarf whose pattern she was learning to respect rather than change, was a note written in careful block letters, "Make room for the hands." She closed the window and watched her breath briefly like a ghost. Across the river, the city was practicing again for morning. Somewhere in the building, someone laughed. Somewhere in the world, a man was holding a napkin and wondering whether to make a fool of himself in pursuit of a better version of his heart. Somewhere else, a girl was saying yes. Esther went to bed knowing only this. The door had been a napkin and a plane, but the house it led to was made of language and stubbornness, and people who refused to let their ancestors' work be reduced to a logo. She fell asleep with the sound of machines stitching in her head. a million small promises coming true one by one, and woke to a day that began with no script and still somehow knew its lines. And if you ask her now what changed everything, she will tell you it was not Paris and not a billionaire and not an acquisition that would someday be taught in business schools as if it had been neat. She will say, "The night I answered in the language my mother taught me. The night a man wrote on a napkin and reminded me we all speak courage before we learn our names. The night the waitress remembered she was an artist, not with paint, not with silk, but with lives."